this woman got up on the stage. Notice she's not just in fancy designer clothes. She's a very unpresuming person. Got up on the stage and in 18 minutes stuck her thumb into the eye of the diabetes establishment. If you read that there, her title of her talk, Reversing Type 2 Diabetes Starts with Ignoring the Guidelines. Now, if she'd been an academic, that talk would be a career-ending move. She would never get another grant from any, that took incredible courage to get up there and do that. And if you haven't seen it, go look at it. You might be, if you're quick, you might get in before the 10 millionth person watches this. This has been a tremendous pivotal change. That one TED Talk, that 18 minutes, was a tremendous pivotal change in, as I see it, in how we in the medical profession regard diabetes and begin to think of it as a reversible disease. The normal duration of, the survival of someone with her disease, the extent of her disease, is typically about 8 months. And she persisted for over 4 years, went through multiple therapies. We had times where the research team was doing Zoom calls, and Dr. Hallberg was doing Zoom call on her phone while she's in the infusion chair getting chemo. That was the commitment. It was just an incredible experience, made an incredible gift to what we wish to do, which is turn diabetes around and have it be an uncommon disease, and when it does show up, we reverse it. So I wanted to start with this slide because when people talk about inflammation, they'll say, oh, and we measured this and that. And typically, the most common thing people measure is C-reactive protein, which is the little yellow highlight partway down the slide. The most generic version of a way to measure inflammation is measure total white blood cell count. And those have been two of the most common things measured. But that whole alphabet soup there that you see is only a partial list of the various biomarkers, but also mediators of inflammation. And you look at that and say, oh gosh, pretty much every one of those has 10, 20, 30 researchers who focus on that. The problem is this is a broad panoply. This is like, people who study one thing is like people who study one key on an organ. Whereas we're talking about an organ with many keys here. And the music sounds very different when you deal with many keys than if you deal with one. One of the interesting things in there, I've highlighted here, people have mentioned leptin. Leptin was a hormone that was discovered in 1994, and it is a adipokine hormone that's made in adipose tissue. It circulates through the blood and it has specific receptors in the hypothalamus, and it tells the hypothalamus, the simplistic concept of it is it tells the hypothalamus that how much fat is stored in the body. Fat stores. The more fat stores you have, the more leptin you make, theoretically, and that sends a stronger signal to the brain, which reduces appetite. So it's a satiety hormone. It's also an inflammatory mediator. And if you infuse leptin into people, the other inflammation, some of the other inflammation biomarkers go up. In people who are inflamed, leptin is up, either primarily or secondarily. So it's not just a satiety hormone. It has multiple functions throughout the body. So this is what makes it complex. So why is this important to us when we're thinking about chronic disease? And from the perspective of diabetes, about 10, 11 years ago, there was this paper, the top one listed there, type 2 diabetes as an inflammatory disease. This paper was published by a couple very courageous researchers in Switzerland. And I say courageous because this was a completely unknown concept in terms of diabetes. People say, oh, diabetes, type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance, or some people believe it's fat in the pancreas. And they published this, and it was met with a lot of skepticism. But the bottom reference there by Jerry Olewski's group, Dr. Gerald Olewski's group at University of California, published in 17, I'm sorry, where he doesn't say diabetes, he says metabolic disease, but in this he says basically that it appears that the root cause, the earliest signs of incipient diabetes can be found in inflammation, that it appears to be inflammatory disease with insulin resistance and body and fat deposition secondary characteristics. So it's getting very much closer to the underlying factors that differentiate a person who's going to develop diabetes versus one who's not. But this is not the first chronic disease that was identified associated with inflammation. If we go back to the early 1990s, there were some studies looking at total white blood cell count and indicated, or it showed very clearly that coronary vascular disease risk is associated with variations in your total white blood cell count. And here's the real kicker. I mean, I was taught when I was in medical school that, and it's still true now, that quote, that I still believe now that the normal levels, the normal range for white blood cell count is roughly between 5 and 10, where the units is number of cells times 10 to the minus ninth per cubic millimeter. But just think 5 to 10, okay? So low range down at 5, upper range 10. And if you can read the fine print there, when you look at the upper quartile versus the lower quartile, so that's the lowest one quarter and the highest quarter within the normal range, the highest quarter has a 3-fold greater risk of heart disease. So this is, what we defined as normal. The upper range of that is associated with a dramatic increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And then in the lower one, the researchers at a famous, very large longitudinal study started in the 1960s called the Framingham Diet Heart Study. They demonstrated that for every one step you go from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9, for every one step you go up, there is a very significant increased risk of heart disease. It's twice as great in men as women. But again, when you go from even just above 6, so you have from 6 to 10, still the normal range, and yet you have a marked increase in coronary risk. So, and this has nothing to do, they showed that risk is completely independent of cholesterol and total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. So this is not lipoprotein-driven heart disease. This is something else, and probably has to do with vascular inflammation, independent of one's cholesterol level. So it's really, and these things were published in the early 1990s. Now, why didn't people act? Well, one thing is, there's no money in measuring white blood cell count. I mean, people figured out how to do that after like a week after von Leeuwenhoek or whoever it was, invented the first microscope. There's no money in this, but it turns out that there is a biomarker, this thing called CRP, that had been known for a long time, but a researcher at Harvard named Paul Ridker developed a way to measure it at very low levels, which is the normal levels. Previously, you could only measure CRP when you had very markedly elevated levels with acute inflammation. And he figured out that the high sensitivity test in the normal range, in what was considered the normal range. But here you look at this graph, and this shows 4 quartiles within a ostensibly healthy population, people without heart disease, and you look from the lowest quartile to the highest quartile, and you can see on the vertical axis the relative risk of developing heart disease, and for the half of the population, the upper 2 quartiles have 4 times the coronary disease risk of the lower ones based on CRP. And this has become kind of the standard biomarker everybody looks at, but it's only one key in the organ. But the question was then, if you make CRP go down, do you reduce the risk of heart disease? And for that, you had to have a drug to do it. And it turns out that the modern statin drugs lower CRP. So Paul Ridker arranged a study involving 17,800 healthy people who did not have markedly elevated LDL cholesterols. So normally you give statins to people with elevated LDL cholesterols. Well, we give it to everybody theoretically, we're supposed to give it to everybody with diabetes as well. And so they took people who did not have markedly elevated LDLs, but they had CRP, C-reactive proteins that were above that middle range where the risk goes way up. And so they gave them this statin drug to 18,000 people in a randomized control trial. By the way, you want to know who funded the study? Okay. And what they looked at was the time to the primary endpoint was either cardiovascular event or fatality. And they ran the study, and at 2 years, they halted the study because they got a statistically significant reduction in first endpoints. So they stopped the study. They said, see, if you lower CRP, you reduce heart disease, you reduce mortality, and that's a good thing. But this was a statistical tour de force. But when you read the paper, in terms of actual mortality, between the placebo group and the statin group, the total number of lives saved was, I think it was 6. So statistically significant, but clinically not significant. Anyway, 4 years later, that was in 2008. In 2012, 4 years later, they published another paper and said, oh, by the way, when we looked at these people who got the statin, the people who got the statin had a 34% increase in their risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It's not advertised. It's not well known that statins are diabetogenic. But they say, but we save more lives with the statin, even though we cause more diabetes. And so this is a disconnect between lowering CRP and reversing diabetes. So we'll give a monoclonal antibody to IL-1 beta. IL-1 beta is one of the cytokines that, when it comes through the bloodstream to the liver, makes CRP. So it's just one step upstream of C-reactive proteins. So they gave a monoclonal antibody to people to see if they reduce their risks of coronary disease. And they gave this to a large number of people. They followed them for a relatively long period of time. And what they found was that on a relatively dose-dependent, so they used different doses, they got about a 20% decrease in the risk of heart disease or of coronary events by giving this monoclonal antibody, reducing IL-1 beta that then secondarily would reduce CRP. And that was, again, a really neat observation. But the problem is that when you reduce IL-1 beta significantly, you also increase the risk of sepsis, because you're kind of tying the hands of the body and dealing with infection. And the cases of sepsis that were induced as a side effect of this drug counteracted the benefit of reducing coronary risk. And so it had a neutral effect. To me, the analogy is you're taking one key off the keyboard, and you're just changing a little bit of one thing, but the balance, because we're talking about a whole panoply, a whole keyboard of different interacting factors involved in inflammation. It makes it extremely complex, and it has evolved to be balanced. It's evolved to turn on when you want to have protection from illness or injury, and you turn it back off. And messing with a balance when the volume is up is a dangerous thing to do. Along comes this concept that nutritional ketosis, the idea that ketones are an excellent fuel for the brain. We now know they're an excellent fuel for the heart. And very likely, we haven't proven this, but it's very clear that from clinical response that they're an excellent fuel for the digestive tract. About 10 years ago, some scientists at the Buck Institute in California, which is a longevity aging institute, and it sounds like that's kind of fairy tale stuff, but the Buck Institute is populated by very, very rigorous scientists looking at factors that increase, improve aging and decrease oxidative stress, and that their impact on aging. And they discovered that if they infused ketones into a mouse for just a day, so we're not talking about a ketogenic diet, we're not talking about long-term ketone exposure. They infuse ketones into a mouse to a level of 1 millimolar, which is kind of at the low end of what we call nutritional ketosis. That 1 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate turned on genes that those mice had been born with, but as long as they fed them a carbohydrate-rich mouse chow diet, those genes weren't active. When they infused beta-hydroxybutyrate, it altered a class of hormones called histone deacetylases. Histones are acidic proteins that wrap around DNA. When it's tightly wrapped around your genes are sitting there doing nothing. If you allow them to unwrap by adding acetyl groups to the histone, then those genes become active. And the genes that are activated are genes that we all, I hope almost all, if not all of us, are born with, that provide potent antioxidant defense. But they only turn on when you have beta-hydroxybutyrate available in adequate quantity in the range of nutritional ketosis. A hormone is something that's made endogenously or consumed in the diet and circulates through the blood and alters the function of other tissues. Now, your liver, my liver, is making beta-hydroxybutyrate, and it circulates through my body and activates my defenses against oxidative stress and inflammation. That's a hormone. A remarkable expansion in our perspective of human physiology. And by the way, this explains why Arctic explorers who went into the Arctic and followed the diet of the Aboriginal people in the Arctic, the Inuit, could live on that diet for years at a time and not develop scurvy. So why do you need vitamin C? It's an antioxidant. But what if you have your own endogenous defenses that work just fine? You don't need vitamin C unless you eat carbohydrates, and then you need vitamin C because you shut off your defenses. So it really have to think of, across the top here, fat releases fat, it goes to the liver, it makes ketones. Ketones, go and feed the brain, they feed the heart, and they probably also feed the gut, which explains why a well-formulated ketogenic diet very frequently resolves irritable bowel syndrome and even inflammatory bowel disease. But we have effects on inflammation at the level of the lungs, we have effects on muscle physiology. People on a ketogenic diet who do extremes of exercise, I don't recommend people go out and run 100 miles, but there are people who do that voluntarily. And typically, when they eat a high-carb diet and a runner does a competitive 100-mile run, they take 6 weeks off before they go back to training. And it is not unusual for ketogenic runners. A, they don't hit the wall. They eat far fewer calories to get to the finish line. Some of them will eat 100 grams of carbs per hour. Most of the high-carb runners are eating 500 calories of carbs per hour and getting GI distress. But when they finish, the low-carb runners finish, typically within a week they're back out in training. So these are the two papers that came out in Science and subsequent paper by Eric Verdin and John Newman and their team at the Buck Institute showing that beta-hydroxybutyrate has a hormonal-like effect in altering our defenses against oxidative stress and inflammation. But how does oxidative stress turn into inflammation? One of the pathways is through the production of some breakdown products of polyunsaturated fat called isoprostanes. So we have polyunsaturated fats in our membranes and our muscles and most of the body. The dominant major active polyunsaturated fat in membranes is arachidonic acid in the brain. The major one is docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, one of the two fish oil fatty acids. These are highly susceptible to damage from free radicals. And if a free radical attacks arachidonic acid, it makes something that looks like a prostaglandin. But prostaglandins are made by enzymes, and when you take NSAIDs, you can block or reduce prostaglandin production. So that's how nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs reduce inflammation. They reduce the enzymatically determined production of things called prostaglandins. These are called isoprostanes because they're not made by enzymes. They're made by just reactive oxygen species approaching a cell membrane, attaching onto this, and producing an inflammatory compound. And so isoprostanes are one of the ways in which inflammation is driven by oxidative stress. So this leads me to hypothesize that there are two kinds of diets. Now, on the right-hand side is the ketogenic diet. And that has two ways of reducing oxidative stress and reducing inflammation. And I'll cover those, one of the other ones I haven't mentioned yet. But on the left-hand side, notice I don't say balanced diet. It's a ketone-suppressing diet. If you eat enough carbs that you don't have ketones, you're suppressing a normal ketogenic state that represents much of our evolutionary history.